Good morning and once again, welcome. This video is being recorded in relation to the lesson that will be presented in Bellflower here at the Rose Avenue Church of Christ on Sunday, October the 29th, 2023. And this is the lesson that will be presented when we gather together at 10:50 in the morning. Now, this particular video here is not going to be the full lesson that I am going to be presenting at that time, but rather this is an addendum to the lesson that I presented last week. Now, we've of course been dealing with drawing closer to God, and we've been dealing with some of the dangers associated with that. We've devoted a lesson to worldliness, and then we've devoted 2 lessons up to this point to materialism. And last week, my recording, which was an hour long, actually addressed some of the dangers associated with materialism, as well as some of the things that will help us to address the attitude of materialism and to overcome and avoid the attitude of materialism in our lives. But when I presented this lesson live at our assembly last Sunday morning on the 22nd, I did not get through the complete outline, and I made a decision at that time that rather than preach over, that I would divide it into a 2-part lesson, something that I typically try to do, or I quite often do from time to time. And so with that in mind, I've made the decision that there's no need in repeating the lesson that I presented last week. But as I was putting together what I'm going to be dealing with this week, I added a couple of things to that lesson. I just wanted to share at least one of those points with you. And then I want to encourage you that if this is the first time you are looking at this, to look at the video from last week on this source, as it's the foundation of what I'm talking about in this particular lesson here. So let's go ahead and just take a few moments and talk about one of the points that I added to that lesson from last week. Now, of course, in the lessons dealing with materialism, we've talked about what materialism is, and we've noted that there are a number of examples in the Bible of materialism, and that was 2 lessons ago. And then last week, we talked about the dangers of a materialistic mindset. We talked about how money is not evil itself. Money is actually morally neutral. It's the attitude that you have. We also spent a little bit of time talking about how everyone is susceptible to materialism. And the point is it matters not whether you are rich or poor. You can be materialistic. It's about your attitude toward the things that you have. We also talked about how debt, which is a major problem in our society, is often contributes to a materialistic attitude and enables people to be more materialistic as they borrow to have things which they actually cannot afford. And then there's the mental concerns. There's the anxiety and worries when one is dealing with resources, and the debt to pay for the resources if that's a part of it. Materialism can affect one's character. One who is materialistic may be greedy, may be selfish, and various other things associated with that. They may look down on the poor. They may actually reach a point where they love money so much that they're willing to do anything, including steal and take advantage of and exploit others so that they can gain more. And also we noted how materialism can threaten the home in various ways, as well as it can threaten congregations of the Lord's people. When those in a congregation have a materialistic attitude, it can affect, it can even go as far as to affect what is taught, because they're thinking about material things over pleasing God first. After that, and this is what I'm going to be emphasizing this week in my Sunday morning lesson, is we did talk about some things that we can do to help avoid materialism or to understand things better. And the first point that we have to think about is that we need to understand that being wealthy is not wrong. There's plenty of examples in scriptures of those who were wealthy, who were very faithful to God. There are those whom God blessed with wealth because of their faithfulness, which is a whole nother story. But the point is God knew their hearts. and so on. The point is, though, when it comes to materialism, it's about the attitude that we have. And that's why we need to learn to be content. And we cannot be caught up in covetousness, which Paul in both Ephesians and Colossians associates with idolatry, a form of idolatry. We talk about how we need to appreciate those things which are of real value. There are many things in this life that are more valuable than material possessions or wealth. Family is more valuable than that. True wisdom is more valuable than that. Being joyful and content with what you have is more valuable than wealth. Godly brethren and your relationship with God, that's of a higher value than temporary possessions. So we need to understand that. And we need to realize that it can jeopardize your soul. We talked about the rich young ruler in Matthew 19, went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. He wasn't willing to give up his materialistic things in order to follow after God. And then we talked a little bit about how we are stewards, which means we have been entrusted with that which God has provided for us. And in reality, we need to understand that everything that we have actually belongs to God. And that's one of the points to give consideration to when we think about materialism. So when we're stewards, what we have actually belongs to God. Are we going to give it to God? We talked about being aware of the dangers of debt. Yeah, I know last week when we were talking about debt from the standpoint of, being a danger, it also dealing with materialism, we need to control debt. And if we are in debt, do what we can to get out of debt. And then we talked about using your material blessings for good, helping the needy and the poor. And if you listen to the lesson after it's presented or look at the outline, I actually expand on that a little bit with a few more verses, because that's something I think we need to focus on and understand our responsibilities as individuals and the limitations of the church. When we are blessed with wealth, we can support the work of the church. And also you might be in a situation where you can take better care of yourself so that you can do more for the cause of Christ. And finally, we talked about that as you give and as you share, you appreciate that things are temporary. And those are all things that we give consideration to as we look at this life. And those are steps that can help us to address materialism. But there's one more that, as I continue to do some research this week, one more point that I want to add to this particular list here. And that is that we need to think properly about ourselves. Over in Romans chapter 12 and in verse number 3, Paul there gives a statement which we often use to emphasize the need for humility, and that is the absolute proper application of this text. But he makes the problem there in verse number 3, where he says, I say through the grace of God given to me to every one who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. What I've always appreciated about this text is Paul does not just say, do not think highly of yourself. He says, don't think more highly of yourself. I think there's a sense in which we need to think highly of ourselves from the standpoint of not that we're better than anybody else, but we need to tell ourselves truthfully that we're worth something, that we're not nothing. Now I realize there's perspective associated with that. And that goes into the not thinking more highly of yourself. There needs to be a humility in our lives, an understanding of where we stand before God. But the bottom line is, we need to have self-esteem in our lives. And we need to think well enough of ourselves that we won't quit and do nothing and just think that we are just absolutely worthless and what's the use of being here? That's the point. And I think that deals with materialism. And there's some things we need to think about. Number one, we need to realize that God values us. Over in 1 Timothy chapter 1, and in verse number 15, as Paul is writing to Timothy about himself, he says, "This is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief." Here was Paul, a persecutor and murderer of Christians, and Paul said, Christ came to save me. And what he's saying there is the reason he did that is, I'm valuable. To God, I am valuable. Over in Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8, Paul talks about how Christ came for everybody. He says, "When we were still without strength in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." We need to understand that Jesus came to this earth and died for me, a sinner, to give me a chance to be reconciled to God. Think about that. Think about that when you consider who you are and whatever your plight is in life. Realize that in God's eyes, you mean something to him. Over in Psalm 139, David there said this. In verse number 13, he said, "You formed my inward parts. You covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are your works, and that my soul knows very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret and skillfully wrought in the lower parts of the earth. Your eyes saw my substance, being yet unformed, and in your book they were all written. The days fashioned for me, when as yet there were none of them." So he's making the point there that to God, I'm special. I mean something. And I want you to understand that while everything in creation was made by God and is wonderful, understand that we have a special place in the heart of God. In Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, as he was dealing with the subject of not worrying and learning to trust God, notice in verses 25 and 26, he makes the point there. It says, "I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or what you will drink, nor about your body, what you will put on. Is life not more than food, and the body more than clothing? Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not of more value than they?" God knows how to take care of the birds. You're more valuable than the birds is what Jesus was emphasizing. He goes on down and talks about how he clothed the grass of the field, which, is cut and then thrown into a fire and stuff. And he says, and he makes the point after that, where if God so clothes the grass, which today is and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, O you of little faith? And he goes on, God knows what you need. He cares about us. That's why he sent Jesus to die for us. It's interesting where in verse 25 and 26, where Jesus there made the point that you're more valuable than they. There's 3 times in the Gospel of Matthew, which means at least 3 different occasions where Jesus emphasized this. He makes the same point in Matthew 10, sending out the 12. Dealing with the apostles. And he says he knows how to take care of a sparrow. You're of more value. You are of more value than sparrows. And in chapter 12, where he's being criticized for healing on the Sabbath, he makes the point about a shepherd going out when there is a sheep that is lost or falls into a pit. He will lay hold of it and bring it out, even if it's on the Sabbath. And he says, of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? So he's making the point, we're valuable where God is concerned. And I want to tell you right now, when it comes to the subject of materialism, that is a factor. When you learn to think properly about yourself, you don't need things to prop you up. And that's a serious point to consider in our lives. There are so many people today that the way they are living their lives, what they are doing is they are searching for meaning. And they feel inadequate, and so they turn to something, whether it's substance, whether it's some type of an addictive behavior, or whether it's material possessions, thinking that those things will make them happy. I'm going to tell you right now, you need to have the attitude that the things of this life will not give you ultimate satisfaction. And that's the bottom line. And so that's an attitude that will help us deal with the subject of materialism. So there you have this addendum dealing with the subject of materialism and some things that we can do to address the subject of materialism. You know, as we conclude this lesson, and I'll go ahead and wrap this up, I conclude it by asking, where is your treasure? You know, over in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus said, do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, for where your treasure is, there your priorities, or where there your heart will also be. We need to remember our priorities. What's most important? We need to remember that if we seek first the kingdom of God, God is able to provide for us the way that we ought to. There's two verses that I would wrap up this subject with. One of them is 2 Corinthians 10, verses 4 and 5. And this is where Paul describes the warfare that we are engaged in. And he makes the point there that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and exalting and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. When it comes to dealing with materialism and so many other things, it's about bringing our thoughts in captivity to the obedience of Christ, bringing even our thoughts into captivity to his obedience. Remember how Jesus in Matthew 16, and in verse 26, he said there, what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his own soul? So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what are you going to choose? Are you going to choose God, or are you going to choose stuff? Who are you going to allow to be your master, or what are you going to allow to be your master? So with that, I conclude this short addendum to the lesson from last week. I hope you find this helpful. And again, if you have not listened to last week's lesson, it is available. As I said, the recording is an hour long, so if you want to divide it up into two different parts, feel free to do that. But I appreciate you listening to me today, and stay tuned for a second lesson today, which will be dealing with the song Sweet Hour of Prayer. But other than that, I will see you all next week. So thank you for listening. Have a good day and have a good week. And goodbye.